let me find what I wanted to start with. Thank you. Let me just summarize what I intended to tell you. Well, what I told you about the other day, and what I intended to tell you at the end of the first class, and for reasons of time, I just didn't get there. In the second part of my presentation, I was telling you about these results that we have for comprehension of clitic left dislocation, and also a canonical SVO order in with 17 months or 18. Let me check the age. The exact age is 17-month old children. These are the results I didn't tell you. Well, I couldn't show you the other day. These are mean looking times in milliseconds across the four critical regions of interest, or windows. Yeah, the baseline, which is what children look at when they hear, "Look, what's happening?" Then the first production of a sentence, the second, and the third. And as you can see, there's only one window which is marked with an asterisk, meaning there is a statistically significant difference between the time that children look at one of the videos as opposed to the other video. For all other videos, the children are not looking at any particular side of the screen, but on the second presentation of the sentence of the clitic left dislocation, they are indeed looking at the representation that matches the image and not the reverse, the one which involves theteral reversal. Yeah. So we take that to mean, we take this to mean that children are understanding this sentence. Yeah. Exemplified here again with another experimental item, l'ovella la rimpellò. Yeah. In all cases, by the way, I did mention that we made the subject and object mismatch in gender. Yeah. Okay, I will not stop at the statistical analysis. Let me just show you briefly the results for adults. Adults gaze is much more directed to the target video, as you can see here. These are much higher. These are much more above 50% than in the case of children. So we have clear evidence for comprehension. But note, there's something that is interesting to note, which is that adults with clitic left dislocation take a while to fixate on the target video. And we think we have an explanation for that. Of course, what we're doing is we are asking in the video, look, what's happening? And then we're giving as sentences which are very pragmatically specific, a clitic left dislocation. We're giving a clitic left dislocation. This is actually pragmatically quite unfelicitous. You cannot answer a question like what's happening with a clitic left dislocation. And yet this is how the experiment is designed. And this justifies the fact that it takes adults a while to actually, a while in terms of milliseconds, of course, to fixate on the right video. Yeah. And we've run this experiment in Mandarin Chinese with a construction that is not like clitic left dislocation, but is sufficiently similar to clitic left dislocation, meaning that it involves movement of the object to a left peripheral position. And we obtained the same results for adult Mandarin speakers, namely this sort of delay in comprehending the back construction, which was the construction we tested in Chinese. Then we, my student Jingdao Zhu, run the experiment again with another leading question. Instead of asking, oh, what's happening? He was asking a question that could be appropriately answered with the back construction, and then this delay in the comprehension of the back construction disappeared because adults understood it right from the first exposure to the sentence. Yeah. So These are the results for adults. Let me go to the conclusions. These are preliminary results in the sense that we only have, well, we don't have very many children. We are aiming for 20 children. But these results indicate that the children acquiring Catalan are sensitive to the target word order, not only to the SVO, but to clitic left dislocation before production starts, before 18 months. It will be a long while before these children produce clitic left dislocations themselves. But here we have evidence they're understanding them, yeah? And as I said, this holds for SVO, but also for clitic left dislocation. And there's only one other result that that I think is available in Romance, which is for French. Although in French, La Sota and Edal tested all the children. I don't think the results will be this different. I think the results for French, for Catalan, or for Spanish, or for Italian should be exactly the same. I wouldn't expect any differences, but those languages have not been tested. And French has been tested, but only for children at 22 months. These results are inconsistent with the claims by, say, people in the so-called usage-based approach to language acquisition of Tomasello and colleagues. The claims that abstract grammar is only operative at ages 3 and 4. Yeah. We think that these results can only be explained if we think that grammar is operative at 17 months. We're using pseudo-verbs. We're making it quite difficult for children to understand, and yet they're understanding it. This is also inconsistent with claims from the generative field, in particular young adults claims that the productive grammar of children shows sensitivity to frequency in the inputs. These constructions are relatively infrequent and they are understood before production starts. So we don't think that it is possible to argue that children at ages, say, 3 are behind in a given structure, if that were the case, because of low frequency. If frequency matters, it has to matter before 17 months. Yeah. So our tentative conclusion here is that the syntactic properties of the target language, in this case Catalan, have to be established at the latest at 16 months, but not later than that. When I say the syntactic properties of the target language, I mean the syntactic properties that bear on word order and that are the ones that make clitic left dislocation, say in Catalan, a well-formed construction. And I assume that, possibly like in other courses here, I assume that these syntactic properties boil down to the setting of, or the feature values of uninterpretable features, yeah? That is, of the features that trigger movement, yeah? So that's it for, oh yeah, here I had some comments on another experimental paradigm that is precisely used by people in the usage-based account, but I will not go into it. So I think I'm basically done with yesterday's lecture. And what I wanted to illustrate was that there are some things that children do very, very well from the beginning and even before they start talking. They have identified their basic word order and they have identified even quite infrequent word orders like clitic left dislocation. Yeah? And we also saw in the production study that I started with that the rates of null subjects or the position of subjects is very much adult-like by the time children are at the stage of MLU 2.5. Yeah. So far, everything I've told you about is are findings that corroborate that children attune to the language they're acquiring from very early on. And this is consistent with very early parameter setting, which was the statement of Wexler 1998. Yeah. Okay, now today I will tell you about some a domain in which children seem to diverge from adults. And this is an observation that we have made on the basis of a study on Catalan and Spanish in collaboration with Ken Wexler and Vicenç Torrents. The article that I will summarize for you, or that I'll tell you about, is this article that appeared in 2010 in Language Acquisition. Yeah, so I'll keep it open in case we need to go back to it, but here comes my presentation. Maybe I should make it full screen. Yeah.
As you want, we can see it perfectly, but
okay. Then I won't do it, because then I'm sure I will lose other facilities. So, okay. So why should we care about this? And what is the interest of what I'll tell you about today? Well, first, I wouldn't want you to think that children do everything right, or that they are adults linguistically from day one or from as soon as they start talking. Clearly, that's not the case. There's some things that, or some domains in which we find discrepancies between children and adults. And one such domain is clitic production. Yeah. So let me illustrate the case. One of the children that was recorded in and whose productions appeared in Childers Beck, these productions don't appear there anymore, but they appeared there some years ago, show that children have object clitics. This is what I'm going to focus on. Object clitics meaning pronominal clitics that stand for an object, for a direct object. I'll call them object clitics. These are illustrated in one. Yeah. So this child says the day he's 2 years, 3 months, 10 days, he said "l'has tirat." So he produced this target clitic. Yeah. But on that very same recording, he said "fico aquí dins." I put here inside. Sentence 2 is ungrammatical. Yeah, it's ungrammatical because ficar is an obligatory transitive verb. And so you cannot omit the object. You either produce a full DP object or you produce a clitic, but you cannot simply omit it. Yeah. So the idea was, and this was not our finding, but something that went back quite a while, that object clitics are produced optionally by children. And that this period of optionality ended around the age of 3 years and a half. Yeah. So this finding, or this optionality, was attested in Italian in an experiment that we replicated by Janet Sheffer, published in the year 2000, and it had been also obtained by Celia Jakubovic and colleagues for French. Yeah, and interestingly, and this draws interesting connections with language impairment, it is also found for an extended period in SLI. Well, SLI stands for specific language impairment. It's not called specific language impairment anymore. It's called DLD, developmental language disorder. And this part of my slides is a bit dated, but for DLD, so children affected with this developmental disorder, both in French and in Italian, have an extended period during which they omit clitics. So they do exactly what Beck was doing in our first slide. And when the clitic is not produced, that is, it is omitted, it may be omitted, or other non-target productions may be found. And this was a finding for Italian by Erosio et al. And by myself in a study of Catalan SLI. So what was found for French by Celia Jakubovic are things like elle gratte, she scratches, and gratte is an obligatory transitive verb, so 3 is also out. And she found that being produced by a child 5 years, 6 months. No typically developing child produces a sentence like 3. But this child with DLD produced it at 5.6. 5 years, 6 months. And in Catalan, what we found is that DLD children often produce things like la mare li pentina, or they produce the dative clitic instead of an accusative clitic. So this is deviant, but it is not exactly, it's not an omission. Yeah, and this was produced by a child aged 5. Yeah. Okay. So the experiment we run with Vicenç Torrent and Wexler that replicated the experiment by Schaeffer is an experiment. Maybe you should not look at the at this slide yet because it's a bit of a spoiler. But it's an experiment where you try to elicit clitics from a child. You create a context in which you refer to a character by its full name. So there's a full DP antecedent, and then you talk about an action that this character is carrying out, and you refer to that is carried out on the character, and then the character has to be pronominal for the sentence to be pragmatically well formed. Yeah. So the story goes like this: you have the king, and then Red Riding Hood, and we enacted this with puppets, and that's why I don't have any pictures of it. So Red Riding Hood has very messy hair, and this king, this puppet king, thinks, oh, I know what I'll do, and he has a comb, and the king combs Little Red Riding Hood, and then we ask, oh, what is the king doing? And experimenter number 2 says, oh, I know, or what is happening? I know, the king is washing Red Riding Hood. And then we say to the child, no, you tell us, what is he doing? And then the child is expected to say, he's combing her. Yeah, and what all of this game is just for the child to say, combing her. Yeah, to produce the clitic. Okay, so and we know that the results in experiments like this were a certain percentage of omission in French and Italian. Yeah, and what happened to us is what you have here in the slide. And our discovery was that clitic omission is not universal. It just doesn't happen in every language. It does happen in Catalan, just as in French and as in Italian. So what you see on the left here are the results for 2, 3, and 4-year-olds, Catalan-speaking children. Yeah. So for 2-year-olds, omission goes as high as 75%, but they produce 25% of clitics. That is, there's no stage at which children do not produce clitics, right? So the claim that children do not have clitics is unfounded. They do produce clitics. Clitics are part of their inventory, and they produce them in the right position. They never place them erroneously. Clitics are preverbal with a finite verb in Catalan, and children produce them there. I think the error rate for clitic placement is 1% or something like that. So at age 3, clitic omission has become much lower, and it's only 25%. So there's quite a difference between 2-year-olds and 3-year-olds. And at 4, omission is marginal. Yeah. Nevertheless, running the experiment, and this was done by Vicenç Torrent in Madrid, running the experiment with Spanish-speaking children, these children produce the clitic 100% of the time at age 2, and also 100% of the time at age 4. And as you see, they omit it very, very marginally at age 3. So here we have 2 languages, not that different in many respects. Nevertheless, in one of those languages, there's clitic omission, in the other one, there isn't. Yeah? And this is a bit of a puzzle. This adds to the puzzle that we had so far. We didn't know why clitics were being omitted by children. Now we know that not only they are being omitted by children, but they're being omitted by children who speak some languages, but not other languages. And one of those languages in which the clitics are omitted is Catalan. Yeah, so Okay, so our study actually encouraged some further studies, and our experiment, Janet Sheffer's experiment, was replicated in Greek by Vina Tsakali and Ken Wexler in 2004, by Babionishev and Marin for Romanian in 2005, by Ilic and, well, Ilic and Dean carried out a different experiment, but in 2004 for Serbian, and Capia carried out an experiment on Albanian in 2010, Elliot and Pirvulescu on French in 2016, yeah? Notice that in these languages, Greek, Romanian, Albanian, and Serbian, there was no clitic emission. Children were not emitting, and the spontaneous production results were consistent with that. Yeah, and this cross-linguistic variation also extended to DLD, to developmental language disorder, because, for example, Manica et al. 2011 found that Greek-speaking children didn't emit clitics when they had DLD, just like their typically developing peers tested by Tsakali and Wexler didn't emit clitics. Yeah, so we truly have two language types, and this is what we argued in the paper. Now, the question, of course, is what is the reason, or how can we account for this cross-linguistic variation? Yeah. Okay, and the account we proposed in the paper was following an account by Wexler in the paper in 1998, where very early parameter setting was first proposed. We followed him in attributing the optional omission to limitations in the computation of a clitic derivation in certain languages. Yeah, in particular, we argued, or he argued before us, and we argued that children optionally omit when the derivation of a given sentence requires the elimination of multiple uninterpretable features by a given DP. Yeah. And the argument in Wexler, and our argument as well, is that those computational limitations disappeared before age 4 in typically developing children due to maturation. Yeah. I don't, maybe in the next slide, I think I should have the derivation. Yes. So why would it be that Spanish, say, is different from Catalan in the computational complexity of deriving the clitic construction? The difference we found was associated with the fact that in Catalan there's what we call participle agreement. Yeah, participle agreement is this phenomenon whereby you have a participle in a compound tense that can agree with the object. In general, objects do not agree with there's no object agreement in Catalan, object-verb agreement, I mean. But in participle agreement constructions, there may be participle agreement. This is even more noticeable in varieties like Majorcan Catalan, where there's more participle agreement nowadays than in let's call it, well, continental Catalan, yeah? But nevertheless, the sentence La Pintada, referring to a wall, la pared, yeah, is fine in Catalan, while La Pintada is also fine, but in Spanish, La Pintado is fine, but La Pintada is out, yeah? Okay, so a bit technically, if I may go through this, the comparison between Spanish and Catalan is as you have it in 5 and 6. In Catalan, we argue, and this is not our analysis, this is built on Keynes' analysis of participle agreement, and also in the assumptions that Dominique Sportiche makes on clitic production, we assume that there is a null object in object position, which is this pro, and that when there is a clitic in as head of clitic phrase, this pro must check the features with the clitic. That is, the features of pro must be matched with the features of the clitic. They have to agree in gender number, yeah? And in Catalan, this movement also involves a step through the specifier of small vp. And this step is the one that gives rise to participle agreement. In Spanish, this null pronominal must also move to the specifier of clitic phrase, but it doesn't stop here, unlike in Catalan, and that's what grants the difference between Spanish and Catalan. In Catalan, there's participle agreement. In Spanish, there isn't. Yeah. Okay, so in Catalan, we have this two-step movement. In Spanish, they only have one-step movement. And the idea is that in languages with participle agreement, you get clitic omission. I will not go into the details of how we predict that it is omission, an optional omission that we get, because I think that maybe we don't have time for that. But I'm happy to talk about it or to go through the paper where it is all detailed. So the claim is, when you have languages with participle agreement, you get clitic omission. When you have languages without participle agreement, you don't get clitic omission. And we can verify that. We can go back to the languages that we've looked at so far. Well, Spanish, of course, is a language without participle agreement, no omission. Catalan is a language with participle agreement, there's omission. But Greek, modern Greek, is a language without participle agreement, therefore we predict no omission. Romanian is also a language without participle agreement, therefore no omission. Albanian is a language without participle agreement, therefore no omission. Serbian is also a language without participle agreement, therefore no omission. And French and Italian are both languages with participle agreement, and therefore the prediction is that there will be optional omission in those languages. So for the languages that have been tested so far, I think that there's no counterexample. Okay, so that's not to say, of course, that the computational limitations that we are arguing that children are subject to only hold for some languages. What we're saying is that different languages make those computational limitations visible, right? And other languages don't make them visible, or at least do not make them visible in clitic constructions, yeah? I'll skip this story about Bulgarian because I don't think we have time for this. But let me now go to a related topic that it is worth mentioning. There's a large part of the literature in which by people like Mihaela Pirbulescu and Ana Teresa Perez-Leroux and researchers in Toronto, who have argued that children are actually using null objects and that they have access to null objects even in languages that do not allow for null objects. Catalan doesn't allow for null objects, yeah. So we don't have null objects. There are languages. So their prediction is, the prediction of such a hypothesis is that there should be no cross-linguistic variation. If children in general allow for null objects, we do not expect that Catalan-speaking children omit more than Spanish-speaking children or than Greek-speaking children. The idea would be that we would have a homogeneous stage at which clitics are omitted, and we think that this claim is contrary to fact. There are languages in which indeed there are null pronouns in the inventory of pronouns, and this is what happens, for example, in European Portuguese. And people who have investigated those languages have found indeed the children omit many clitics, but this is not clitic omission as we think of it. This is target-like clitic omission, right? This is in fact not clitic omission, but null object production, null pronoun production, yeah? There is a very interesting experiment by Teresa Gruta in 2006, to show that in languages with obligatory clitics, for example, Catalan, children in comprehension show that they are not interpreting a sentence without an object as involving a null object. I'll show you the details in the other paper there, because I have the materials there. So I have to remind myself that I want to tell you about these comprehension results that are consistent with our idea that children are not at any point thinking that Catalan is a language with null pronouns that allows null objects. Children do not think that. They never treat the lack of an object as meaning there is a null object there, a syntactically active null object there. Okay, so there are some further predictions that we have been able to test with Catalan, given that Catalan has a very large inventory of clitics. Yeah? We can make, on the basis of our hypothesis, which, by the way, is called the unique checking constraint hypothesis. And I should mention at this point that the unique checking constraint was not thought of to account for clitic omission. The first, the hypothesis was first proposed to account for something, a phenomenon that is very clearly a child language phenomenon, the so-called root infinitives or optional infinitives that you find in the non-null subject languages. In non-null subject languages like English, children produce sentences that appear to have no tense, where they're using an infinitive instead of a finite verb. This is a very widespread phenomenon. You find it in very many languages in the world. In actual fact, you find it in all the non-null subject languages. And the UCC was thought of to account for that. And root infinitives happen exactly at the same time that clitic omission happens, that is, until 3 years, 6 months of age, roughly. Yeah. Okay, so here I'm just investigating the predictions of the unique checking constraint with clitics. With finiteness, because Catalan is a null subject language, we do not expect to find optional infinitives in Catalan. Children do not say things like la Maria parla, to say la Maria parla. So that prediction is fulfilled. We don't have root infinitives. Yeah. So what happens with other clitics? Well, we have tested. When I say we, I mean myself with some of my students or colleagues, and I'll give you their names as we go along. We have tested a range of clitics, starting with indirect object clitics and partitive clitics and first, second person object clitics. And we expect there to be variation in the omission rate or in the availability of omission in different Romance languages, depending on the syntactic features that are involved in the derivation of those clitics. So in the first experiment, again, an elicitation, all of these are elicitation experiments carried out with puppets. We elicited sentences like li dona un regal, gives him or her a present. And we also elicited first and second person clitics, as in empantina. In the case of empantina, what you have to do is you have a puppet, but you also have the child, and you have to comb the child, evidently, so that he ends up saying empantina. Yeah, that's what the it refers to the child. So you have to do something to the child. Okay. So what happened with indirect object clitics? This was work carried out with Marta Musella, and it was published in 2009. And here again, we had 2-year-olds, 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds. Now, here omission was much, much lower than with direct object clitics. At age 2, we had omission around 30%, meaning that the remaining over 60% of the time, children produced the indirect object clitic. For people who think that omission has something to do with semantic salience, for instance, this would be very surprising because an indirect object is never as salient as an object, is never as high in the thematic hierarchy, and so on and so forth. And we found a statistically significant difference between the omission of direct object clitics and indirect object clitics. And this is predicted by the hypothesis because the derivation of an indirect object clitic does not give rise to participle agreement for sure, and does not involve more than the elimination of one interpretable feature. There's just one movement, and so there's no two-step movement, and therefore we predict that children will not omit it. So if anything, we would have to say that what we do not expect is that 2-year-olds omit it as much as 25% of the time. But these children are very, very small. So maybe there's something to be said in terms of production and not so much of grammar here. Okay, what happens with first and second person object clitics? This was work with Noemi Forton in 2014. And I can give you, of course, all the references to the places where these can be found. What we found again is that we tested 2, 3, and 4-year-olds. And again, omission is much, much lower than with third person clitics. Now, this was tested in continental Catalan, and in continental Catalan, we do not have participle agreement with first and second person clitics. Therefore, the idea is that there is no double checking, no double elimination of features, and the prediction is that children will not omit. Well, they do omit some of the time, but not as much as they omit third person object clitics. If you take a language like maybe Mallorcan Catalan or Italian, where you have participle agreement with first person clitics, like mi ha pettinata in Italian, yeah, mi ha pettinata, then our prediction is that children will omit first person object clitics. Yeah? No testing has taken place for that, so this experiment remains to be done. So, oh, this is not very nicely presented. I wonder why it came out like that. I'm sorry. Now, of course, the whole of our story depends or rests on the assumption that 2-year-old children know that Catalan is a language with participle agreement. Yeah, we're saying they're omitting because they have difficulty in computing a clitic derivation in a language with participle agreement. Therefore, we are assuming that they know that Catalan is a language with participle agreement. And it is crucial that they know it at age 2, because at age 2 they are omitting. So what we had to do next was to test or to see how they were doing with respect to participle agreement. And here I meant to exemplify participle agreement. I'm sorry, the formatting has gone wrong. But for example, Julia, one of the girls we tested, said in the experiment at 2 years, 5 months, amenjadas. Yeah, and she produced participle agreement with clitic omission. Yeah, and this is known to happen. This has been known to happen for quite a long time. Antinucci and Miller in '76 already showed that children performed participle agreement even in the absence of a clitic, ai persi due, which is ne hai persi due, but this child said at age 2, ai persi due. This finding that they can omit and produce participle agreement is actually consistent with our more fine-grained analysis that I will not have time to go into. So in our experiment, in our elicitation experiment, we had half of the items in the present tense and half of the other items in the perfect tense. And with the perfect tense, of course, children had a chance to produce participle agreement. So did they produce it? They did produce it. They produced it 27% of the time at age 2, 10% of the time at age 3, 28% of the time at age 4 or 5. On total, 21% of the time, children produced participle agreement. And we also tested adults at the university. and adults produce 30% of participle agreement in the very same task that we did for children, except we didn't run it individually, we did it in class, yeah? So we found no significant differences in the percentage of participle agreement and adult and child Catalan. And of course, in the Spanish version of the experiment, no Spanish-speaking child produced any past participle agreement ever. Yeah, so the production results seem to corroborate that Catalan-speaking children at age 2 know that Catalan is a language which allows past participle agreement, and that Spanish-speaking children at age 2 know that Spanish does not allow past participle agreement. Nevertheless, to further corroborate this, we run a grammaticality judgment task. Well, I'm sure you all know what a grammaticality judgment task is. Yeah, I can assume that. Can I? Elga, Maria del Mar? Yeah, grammaticality judgment task is a task where you ask the speaker if a sentence is grammatical or ungrammatical. If you ask a child, or if you ask an adult even who's not linguistically sophisticated, you don't say grammatical or ungrammatical, you say, does it sound good, does it sound bad? Or, well, with children, you say, does it sound good? Well, as a grammaticality judgment task is a very difficult task to run with 2-year-olds, because most of the time, 2-year-olds think you're asking them about the truth of the sentence, not whether it is well-formed or ill-formed, yeah? So, what we did was to have as control items subject-verb agreement mismatches, which is the very first thing that children seem to detect as ill-formed, or that they've been shown to be able to detect. So, oh, here again, for some reason, the examples are not properly formatted. Well, I'm sorry about that. So, the control items were things like la senyora condueixen, yeah, with a singular subject and the plural verb. And we only included the results for the children who detected some of these ungrammatical subject-verb agreement mismatches. For those who didn't detect that, we simply excluded them from the task. And in the task, we asked them about sentences like la feta has made it, the tower, with participle agreement. Les ha plantat, les pastanagues. And in Spanish, las ha colgadas, which is clearly out. And we expect, if children are adult-like, like we are assuming, we expect that they'll accept la feta, las ha plantat, but that in Spanish they'll reject las ha colgadas. Yeah, and these are the materials we used. Here you have l'àvia té unes decoracions de Nadal, and then you show the next picture. Aquí ja les ha penjades. You ask, does this sentence sound right? Okay, and well, subject-verb agreement mismatches are bad, of course, but this is to be expected because if children didn't rate them badly, they were not included in the experiment. So what happened with overt agreement? Well, children at 2 accepted it 100% of the time. And they also accepted no overt agreement 100% of the time for Catalan. Yeah, and at 3, they also accepted overt agreement and no overt, and lack of overt agreement. We are assuming, by the way, that when there's no overt agreement, the syntactic operations on the line, the derivation are exactly the same. Yeah. So then what? So here you could say, okay, well, these children are very small. They're just accepting everything. There's a yes bias. They say, yeah, fine. Except that, of course, the yes bias didn't make them accept the subject-verb agreement mismatches. But things become more interesting when we move to Spanish, because when you move to Spanish, lack of agreement is accepted 93% of the time by 2-year-olds, 100% of the time by 3-year-olds. But if you move to overt agreement, that is participle agreement, overt participle agreement in Spanish, they only accepted 53% of the time, and only 6% of the time at age 3. Yeah. So, and if you run the statistics, then maybe I have them in the next page. Yes, there are statistically significant differences between Catalan and Spanish for the agreement condition for 2-year-olds, 3-year-olds, for 4-year-olds, and for all ages when they're collapsed. So right from the beginning, as soon as you can test them, the performance of Catalan and Spanish children with respect to participle agreement is different. So these results are in line with what we would expect if we think that children know that Catalan is a participle agreement language and Spanish is not. Yeah. Okay, these are the graphic. This is a graphic representation of grammaticality judgment results, but I don't need to go into that. And I think I will skip the past participle agreement in Quebec French, or maybe I'll go through it very quickly. Pirvulescu and Belzil were going to run the very same experiment that we run for Catalan. In the end, they had a preference task in which they asked, which one do you prefer? And they gave them the option with participle agreement and the option without participle agreement. And what happened? Well, in actual fact, they didn't really prefer the past participle agreement, but neither did adults. So this is not so surprising. Past participle agreement is optional, both in child and adult Quebec French, and so these results do not really run against our results. Yeah. And interestingly, what they found is that sometimes these Quebec French children produced past participle agreement with a full object DP. They produced things like le père a ouvert la fenêtre. In actual fact, our experiment had been designed to have verbs that would give rise to participle to audible past participle agreement in French, because we designed the experiment together with Michaela Pirvulescu. And so all the verbs that we had in the experiment would have audible past participle agreement in Quebec French, and children overproduced past participle agreement in Quebec French. Quite clearly, that's not what happens in say, Spanish. No child ever produces or overproduces past participle agreement. So I think it's quite clear that from age 2-3, children have established what the parameter corresponding to participle agreement in their languages. Yeah, I will not stop at Italian. There's somehow mixed results, and I will not tell you either about the analysis that we're adopting, which is Alessandro and Roberts. I think maybe there's no need for me to stop here. This is what I wanted to say. Well, maybe I should not close this because now I'm going to the other paper where I want to tell you about the comprehension experiment. Yeah. So this is an article on the acquisition of clitics, and here I will have an opportunity to not only to talk about the production of clitics and the comprehension of clitics, but something that I also promised I would do, which is the comprehension of reflexives. Yeah, and these all appeared in this paper that can be found in the Oxford Research Encyclopedia and appeared in 2020. Let me first tell you about the comprehension experiment by Therese Grutter, which I think is very, very interesting. Okay, so let me find it first. Yeah, if I have time, I will also tell you about some other varieties of Spanish. I think I'm doing fine for time today. Okay, so here is Therese Grutter's experiment. Yeah, so in her conditions, this was a truth conditional task. The child had to say whether, in these kind of tasks, children have to say whether something is true or false of the graphic representation they have. Yeah. So the conditions in her experiment were sentences like those in 6. Dora monte sur le rocher, which means Dora climbs onto the rock, and monte le sac sur le rocher. Dora pulls the bag onto the rock. Yeah, this is an intransitive and a transitive use of monte. Yeah, so the idea is that if children allow for a null object in French, then they should be able to interpret Dora monte sur le rocher as meaning Dora monte le sac sur le rocher. That is, they should be able to give a transitive interpretation to 6a. Yeah? Because in that case, the object would be a null pronoun. But that's not what they do. Yeah? In a transitive context, they reject, in a transitive story, they reject the sentence Dora monte sur le rocher. That comes to show that they do not have in their interpretation a null object interpretation available. Yeah. Okay. So this is Teres Gruter's experiment. Yeah. If you run the experiment in European Portuguese, which is something that Costa and Lobo have done, in Portuguese, there is a null object and children are willing to interpret a verb without an object as transitive, right? So that means that there is no transitive interpretation of a sentence with clitic omission. Children produce clitic omissions, but they don't interpret sentences without a clitic as transitive ever, yeah? Okay, I hope that's clear and I'm not going too fast. Okay, so let me, in this paper, I also reviewed how children do well on clitic placement, and they do very well on clitic placement, and how they perform clitic climbing, and they do well on clitic climbing. They never do things which are, and they do well on clitic doubling as well when that's possible, like in Spanish, te regañado a ti. They produce clitic doubling when that's possible in the target language. Okay, all fine. Now, let me talk briefly about this other topic, which has been one of the earliest findings in language acquisition and has had its relevance as well in Romance and having to do with clitics. And in fact, the very first experiment that I run had to do with this. So I ran my first experiment in sometime in late 90s, precisely on this. Yeah, the finding by Chen and Wexler in 1990 was that a child exposed to English understands perfectly well the sentence, "Is Mama Bear washing herself?" That is, the child understands the reflexive very, very early, as early as you can test them. But "Is Mama Bear washing her?" with a pronoun is misunderstood until age 6 sometimes, because children can interpret "Is Mama Bear washing her?" as "Is Mama Bear washing herself?" That is, they can interpret the pronoun as a reflexive, while they never misinterpret a reflexive as a pronoun. Yeah. Okay. Now, Chen and Wexler argued that because children understood both reflexives and pronouns when the antecedent was a quantifier, it could not be claimed that children didn't have command of binding conditions. And I understand that binding conditions are the conditions that regulate the presence of reflexives and pronouns. Yeah, the condition A of, well, the classical binding theory, condition A tells you that a reflexive must be bound to its governing category, and condition B tells you that a pronoun cannot be bound in its governing category. It has to find its antecedent outside. Yeah, so the antecedent of her must be outside this clause, while the antecedent of herself must be in the clause. In fact, it must be the subject of the clause. Yeah. So the way that this was interpreted in the literature was that children had command of principles A and B of the standard binding theory. However, there was something that that is called a pragmatic principle that controls rule R, that controls the presence of pronominals, that allows for so-called accidental co-reference. And the children were actually allowing her to accidentally co-refer with Mama Bear. Well, with a reflexive, they performed just like adults. Rule R was not involved in the interpretation of 15a, and therefore they never failed with 15a. This problem with 15b is what has been known as delay of principle B effect. And later on, it's been called the pronoun interpretation problem. Yeah. Now, what's interesting here is that McKee in 1992 run the same experiment that had been run for English with Italian, with the sentences Gianni si lava, Gianni lo lava, and found the children were perfectly good at interpreting those sentences. So there was no delay of principle B effect in Italian. Yeah? And this is exactly the experiment that I replicated. I replicated with Linda Escobar and for Catalan. And what is it that we found? Well, we found that, for example, for 3-year-olds, for Catalan 3-year-olds, comprehension of reflexive on a truth conditional task was 96% correct. So 3-year-olds have no problem whatsoever with reflexives. And with pronouns, they were also very good. There was comprehension in 93% of cases. Yeah. Nevertheless, there was one condition in which children failed and in which the principle B effects emerged, which are sentences like the one exemplified in 17. La nena la veu ballar, the girl sees her dance. This is an exceptional case marking context in which the subject of ballar has accusative, and so this is why it's called exceptional case marking. In these kind of cases, children allowed for the co-reference of la nena and la. Yeah, so there was a principle B effect. So what we find is that in the Romance languages, Catalan amongst them, and the Catalan result is not any different from what we have in other languages, there is a principle B effect, but only in certain constructions and not in the general in the general pronominal construction, as in 16b, Gianni lo lava or Joan el renta. Yeah, Joan el renta. Children never think that O is co-referential with Joan. Yeah. Okay. As I say, this is not a smashing result because we had it before for French and we had it for many other languages, for Spanish as well, by Bau et al., Linda Escobar amongst them. So the findings for Catalan are not surprising, but they come to show that delay of principle B effect is not found with clitic constructions, unless we have an exceptional case marking, which may be an altogether different construction, and we could hypothesize what underlying structure exceptional case marking involves that would be the one that would justify the presence of this principle B effect. Yeah. What's perhaps more relevant is that pronouns in English, as I told you, allow for accidental co-reference, and this is exemplified in 19a. So apparently this is good in English. Everybody loves Oscar, even Oscar loves him. Yeah, this is one of the examples that Tanya Reinhardt, who studied this very much and who also proposed a revision of the classical binding theory, used as example of accidental co-reference. Yeah. Now this sentence does so you find in English some cases in which a pronoun can have a local antecedent. It will be accidental co-reference. It will probably not involve co-indexation, but nevertheless, the sentence, even Oscar loves him, with him referring to Oscar, is okay. But these kind of sentences are completely out in Romance, or they're certainly completely out in Catalan. We cannot say, tothom estima l'Oscar, fins i tot l'Oscar l'estima. I think this is out. I hope, well, maybe there's other Catalan speakers in the audience who may want to disagree with me, but to me, it is very clear that the accidental co-reference that is available in 19a is not available in 19b, right? And so the adult judgments actually square with what we find for children. Children allow co-reference in examples like this in English, but children do not allow co-reference in examples like this in Catalan, right? So, as I say in the in this chapter, the proper treatment of the delay of principle B effect is still an object of debate, but I think that it really has to do with a referential import of clitics. That is the fact that in English we have a pronoun and in Catalan we have a clitic does have repercussions in the referential properties. And this is what makes child performance difference eventually, yeah? Okay, so I guess I am done for this. Maybe since I have some time, I will make sure I have time for questions today, but we have half an hour, yeah? Is this correct?
Yes, yes.
Yes, okay. So what is it I wanted to tell you a bit more about? I have been, I've told you that this analysis that we proposed for clitic emission is a maturational account of clitic emission, yeah? What do we, what is meant by maturational account? The idea is that, as I said, children lack the ability to compute certain derivations where the elimination of two features is necessary. You may understand what I say, or maybe this is not understandable to you, but the general idea, I think, should be understandable, that there's some computation that the child cannot perform, right? So I have shown that this allows us to make very specific predictions as to what child performance will be like in a variety of languages, given the adult grammar, what we're assuming for the adult grammar. This also means that we are definitely assuming that children have established the feature values of their target language. That is, they know there is a non-interpretable feature that must be eliminated in small v. Yeah, they know that, and that's what gives rise to participle agreement, or well, whatever, or they know that you know that there's WH movement, or there's movement of a topic to the left periphery, so on and so forth. So we very strongly believe that there's very early parameter setting, and this is also consistent with my first lecture where I showed you that we think there is evidence for children having extensive knowledge of the word order parameters underlying the language they're acquiring. Yeah. So what does maturation mean? Maturation means that there's something that is internal to the child that changes at a given point in the child's life, and that allows him to perform or to have certain, to perform in differently, or that changes its grammar, but that's not due to the environment. This is not learning. It's not that the child is not learning and suddenly the child learns and starts producing clitics or producing clitics consistently. All there is to be learned has been learned, and it's just the grammar itself that has not matured. The idea of maturation is actually quite standard in anything that involves growth, and language acquisition is an instance of growth. So we should perhaps not be surprised that maturation is part of the story for language acquisition. And I think that a very strong argument in favor of this maturational hypothesis is that we have independent evidence for it. And some of it I have presented it here, namely the case of developmental language disorder. Developmental language disorder is a pathology that involves delay, maybe delay for life, in language acquisition. And here the claim would be that this stage, this UCC stage that makes children omit optionally, lasts longer for children with DLD. So we have the typically developing children's maturation out of this stage is at age 3.6, and for children with DLD, it is later. It is later, and perhaps they'll never come out completely out of it, completely, sorry, because there's no testing done on DLD adults. No one tests DLD children past a certain age, and it's quite possible that this maturation is never accomplished. Yeah, I don't have anything to say for that about that. I mean, I think that people should go out and do it and test DLD children when they reach their 20s and when they reach their 40s and their 50s. But I don't know why people are not doing it. Maybe these adults don't want to be tested anymore. So, so the idea that there's maturation squares with the fact that we do have a given population with a pathology whose performance is further delayed. Yeah, this has a very strong maturational flavor. Another consequence of the maturational view on what I've been telling you is that the patterns that we find in first language acquisition in, say, 3-year-olds should not be found in second language learners. L2 learners should not perform the same way. Their performance should be different because L2 learners are not subject to maturation. They're mature. Well, assuming they're second language learners when they are past 3.5. Yeah, if they're second language learners at 3, okay, we expect this. But if they're not, if they're 4, then we don't expect the same patterns. The patterns of second language acquisition are expected to be different from the patterns here. Yeah. So these are some of the predictions that assuming a maturational account makes. That is, that you may find a pathology that has to do with the timing of acquisition, and that's DLD, and that you find discrepancies between second language learners, adult second language learners, and first language learners. That's something that is expected on a maturational account. I don't know if there's anything else I wanted to say about maturation. Well, on my last lecture on Friday, we'll be talking about another phenomenon that has also been accounted for in terms of maturation, namely passives, yeah, the acquisition of passives. Of course, if you start assuming that language acquisition may be subject to maturation, then the next question is, well, this is one maturational event. Do we have more maturational events? When you open the door to maturation, then of course you may expect more than one maturational event in the life of a human being and regarding language. And that's what I'll talk about on my last lecture, passives. And I'll give some further arguments for the maturational account, yeah? But I just wanted to stress that maturation doesn't come for free. Is not an easy way out to say, oh, well, we don't know how to explain it, so we'll say the child is immature at this stage and then matures at age 3.6. It's that this comes with some empirical implications that can be tested. Yeah. So I guess that I've explained what I wanted to explain today, and maybe we can have questions, and I'm happy to take questions for the first lecture as well, of course.